Good morning. Thanks, Anne-Marie, for inviting me to be part of your training this morning for the Dementia Trials Network. And the subject I'm going to be talking to you about are really about the quality in clinical trials, regulatory affairs, which would be when you're applying to the regulator and to the research ethics committees, and also ethics. So we'll also be looking a bit at risk management, etc., and trials. So just to introduce myself, my name is Ruben Keane. I work with the National Clinical Trials Office as their Quality Reg Affairs Manager, and I also work for Trinity College in Dublin as their person of sponsor oversight, so head of clinical sponsor oversight. So I wear two hats, and I've been involved in clinical trials for a long time, more time than I'd probably care to let you know. Okay, so what are we going to look at this morning? Well, we're going to look at clinical research legislation in Ireland at the moment and a bit about how it's changed in the very recent past. We'll look at regulatory, research ethics and insurance requirements in Ireland. We'll do a little bit on informed consent and consenting and changes there that have happened recently. And then we'll finish up with some quality and risk management. Now, I think we'll take questions at the end. I'll be attending online and you'll be able to ask questions. So just make a note of anything as you go along if there are things you wish to ask me. So this is actually part of a slide presentation I did back in 2021. I was there looking ahead at the changes in legislation that were coming up at the time. The big one being the clinical trial regulation, which came in 2022. Then we also had changes in the area of medical devices. So we had two new medical device regulations come in, the MDR and the in vitro device regulation. So looking at it there, I had envisaged that we were at the caterpillar stage in 2021, and we were going to be moving towards this beautiful emergence of a butterfly in 2023. Which we're now in 2023, of course. So really, if we're in the middle of a huge change, I suppose is what I'm trying to make you realise, in the most significant change in research legislation in the last 20 years. We also know it's a very painful process to move, I suppose, giving birth, which is kind of moving from the caterpillar to the butterfly. So I suppose it has been not without its challenges, and we'll look at some of the opportunities and challenges that we now have with our new legislation. So the big change really has been the change from a clinical trial directive, which was 2001, and we have now moved to the clinical trials regulation. So this was published in 2014 and only came into force in January. Why did it take so long to come into force? Well, basically because they needed a huge kind of technical input on setting up a kind of a one portal and database for all the clinical trial applications all over Europe to go into. So rather than every country having their own system, which has been the case up to 2022, now we have one central portal where we all can apply for approval in as many countries and as many sites in Europe as we wish. The difference between an EU directive and a regulation, well, a directive has to be put into national law, and the EU regulation, the wording is taken as is and goes into the national law. So the problem, I suppose, with the directive was that there were various kind of interpretations as it was being put into the law in different countries. So, for example, in the Irish version, kind of law version, excuse me, the clinical trials directive was SI 190, which you may have heard of. And for example, in that, in Ireland, if a person who is maybe illiterate, can't write, can't read, if they're giving consent, you can take their verbal consent, but it required two witnesses to witness that. Whereas in other countries, they had just said one witness. That is one difference that was kind of, one lack of harmony. Another one was that, say, in the UK, the legislation there kind of allowed for nurses to take consent in regulated trials, whereas here in Ireland that wasn't the case in the law, and the HPRA, who do the inspections of trials, etc., they would not have been happy if anyone other than a medic or a qualified dentist, if it was a dental study, had taken the consent. So they're the kind of things that they weren't exactly as harmonised as everyone had hoped with this EU clinical trials directive. So the regulation was another step towards harmony, and also transparency. So as I say, a regulation goes into the law, the local law, as it's written. So there shouldn't be any room for interpretation. Now, within that, it does say there's a couple of places in the clinical trial regulation where it says that the national, say Ireland could add, if they wanted to add extra, in one or two places, but it's quite rare. So just looking at, I mentioned there the clinical trial regulation goes into the law as is, as it does, but it's still, you still need some kind of law to kind of say we're now enacting this regulation. So in Ireland, that's SI 99, and it implements the clinical trial regulation and sets out the responsibilities, for example, for the, the stakeholders and the powers of the HPRA, who are our national regulatory authority in Ireland. And then another SI, another statutory instrument, 41, was put in to establish the National Research Ethics Committee and the National Office for Research Ethics, because obviously that was needed as we are now in a totally different kind of system of applying for clinical trials. There's also one other relevant bit of legislation there, which is around the medicinal products. So generally, the national legislation shouldn't introduce any requirements above and beyond those outlined in the clinical trial regulation. There are one or two exceptions to that, but generally, it should be the same in every country. It should be more harmonized. So what are the main and key features of the clinical trials regulation, which came in 2022? Well, basically, we now have one central integrated application, whereas before you would have been applying to every country separately, and you would have been applying to the regulatory authority and the ethics committee separately. Now you just do one application, one set of documents goes in, and you can apply to all the European countries at the same time if you wish, or as many of them as you wish, and as many sites within those countries as you wish. So the applications go through an EU clinical trial portal. It always reminds me of Harry Potter, that portal. He used to talk a lot about port keys, but anyway, it's an EU clinical trial portal, which is a portal being a kind of an opening or a door, really. So there's only one place you put in your clinical trial application, and that goes into the the database, and that whole system is called the Clinical Trial Information System, or CTIS. And you'll hear a lot of people talking about, well, in the area I work in regulatory, etc., you hear a lot of people talking about CTIS. It's the Clinical Trial Information System. And that was obviously quite a complex and structure, and it took quite a lot of time to build, because if you look at the date of the publishing of the clinical trial regulation was 2014, and then it took until 2022 to put it, to enact it. So basically it took a long time to build this. So basically we have a single fee per member state. We have identical rules for conducting clinical trials across the EU, and we have strictly defined timelines for assessment. Again, all those things are improvements, really, because like in the past, if I was applying to do clinical trial in 3 different countries in Europe, I would be applying to the regulator and the ethics committee, and each of those would have their own timelines. So it might be I could start the trial in one place, within 3 months, and then it might take me 6 months in another place, or more. So strictly defined timelines for assessment and approval, and we have an increased efficiency of the approval process. So like it's very, exactly where it is in the process at any time. Another key feature, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail when we talk about consenting, is that the CTR, the clinical trial regulation, allows for nurse consenting in clinical trials of investigational medicinal products, and that's new. That had not been the case before. So here, a very simplistic diagram. Here's me in the past applying to lots of different regulatory authorities and research ethics committees in the different countries. And you can imagine now, if you're working in say, a large commercial company, and you're doing your trial in 10, 12, 14 countries, that was a lot of work. Whereas now it's literally one set of documents goes in, and then you get your approval, one approval from all the different countries at the same time, which is kind of amazing. Now, if we look at the timelines, I mentioned there that there are very defined timelines. Again, so it means you know exactly where you are. So validation, you have 10 days for validation. Now, if there's a problem with that, they can come back with what's called an RFI, a request for information. You know, if you haven't put something in, or if something is unclear, they can come back. You'll get a message through the system, and it will ask for more information. And so you have a request for information, and you've got 15 days to reply to that. But let's suppose that you're an excellent regulatory person and that you have put in your application for your new trial, and it's been validated without a problem, 10 days. So then there are two parts of the application. So there's the part that we would kind of always have thought, really, I suppose, as the HPRA part, which is, you know, very much the scientific part. You'd be talking about you'd have the protocol, but you'd also have information about the drug, the investigator brochure, all that sort of thing. And then you'd have part two, which would be the other part, which goes to ethics, which would again would have the protocol, but it would include the patient information leaflet, the informed consent form, the GP letters, anything patient facing would go in then to the ethics. So similarly, in a way that it's still kind of split, but these are actually done at the same time. There's a coordinated assessment. And there's a 45-day timeline for that. Now, it can be up to 50 days for advanced therapeutic medicinal products. So if you're doing a gene therapy or something like that, it could be up to 50 days, but not much of a difference there. So then they can come back again with a request for more information at that stage, which would be usually with a 31-day timeline. So you have 31 days to reply to them. And then, but if in the ideal world, which is never, where if everything is really clear and they don't have any request for information, you could get that through the part one and the part two in as little as 45 days. And then you actually get the decision per member state within 5 days. So the whole process, if you add up there your 45, 10 and 5, you could theoretically have approval to do your study in every country in Europe in 60 days, which is amazing, and that's a huge difference. So the process I mentioned there, the kind of the two parts. Part one, which is the scientific core documentation, which is kind of the stuff that used to go to the HPRA, and the second part is the ethical country and site specific, excuse me. So obviously, if you're doing a clinical trial in 5 or 6 different countries with different languages, etc., different culture, then you're going to have your patient information leaflet is going to be in different languages. So that bit will be country specific. It may even be site specific if there's a particular if there's, I don't know, some particularly cultural or some particularly site specific thing you have to put in there. But both of these are carried out simultaneously. So it's not 45 days for one and then 45 days for the other. They're both done at the same time. So what happens is, once I put in my clinical trial application into the CTIS, the Clinical Trial Information System, then say I'm doing it in 3 countries. Let's say Germany, Belgium and Ireland, just for the sake of an example. So basically, each of those is called the concerned member state. So they're the member states that are taking part in the trial, where there are sites. And then you have one member state then is designated as the reporting member state, and they'll coordinate the review, and they'll be the one coming back to the sponsor with the request for information or with the approval decision. So basically, they take all the comments from the different regulatory authorities and ethics committees, pull it all together, you know, because obviously there's going to be some duplication, and then that it'll be one set of questions for your request for information will come back to you, and then one decision will come back to sponsor. So at the moment we are kind of, well, we're coming through a transition period still. So for any new trials that started from the 31st of January in 2023, then they all had to come in under the clinical trials, the new system, basically clinical trial information system under the clinical trial regulation. Whereas kind of there was a year there where you could do your application under the old clinical trials directive or the new. So thankfully now it's clearer since the 31st of January. Everything has to be in the new system, the new one portal system. And at the moment, if you have an existing trial ongoing, you have to move that trial to the new system by the end of January 2025. And in fact, the EMA and the HPRA passed it on to the sponsors and to other stakeholders like NCTO, indicating that really you'd be best off to have that done by the end of October 2024. If your trial is going to be continuing on past to the 31st of January 2025, and you got the approval under the Clinical Trials Directive, the old system, then you need to actually put this into you need to transfer it over to CETUS into the new system. Just we're going to have a quick look now at the benefits and maybe some of the challenges. So the benefits, it's one submission for multi-site, multinational clinical trials, which I have to say, as someone who had to cope with sending the individual applications to different countries, it's kind of amazing. So one submission, and you can get approval in as many countries in Europe as you wish, and as many sites as you wish. So it's an integrated decision, one decision. In the past, I found, you get maybe you get approval from the HPRA, and then maybe NREC come back with they're looking for a change in the protocol, which HPRA didn't ask for. So then you've got to go back around to the HPRA again to implement that. So it can be it can be a kind of a bit of a circle there, whereas integrated decision from both the regulatory authority and the Research Ethics Committee across all countries, one decision. Faster and consistent timelines. Again, you can actually predict. So a company wanting to do a trial and set up a trial, it was really, really difficult to predict that in the past, because different ethics committees and different regulators took different amounts of time. Excuse me, so now it's possible in 60 days. It'll probably be longer because they will come back with a request for information. So I'm hoping, maybe I'm a bit naive, but I'm hoping that companies are more likely to include several countries, including Ireland, when they're setting up their trials. Like if you're doing the same amount of work almost for one country as you're doing for 12, 15. So you may as well apply for as many as you like. And you can, the thing is, you can get permission for one or two and then add other countries later if you wish. Another thing is the transparency and the public access. So there's a lot of information on the CETUS system. So things like the protocol is published, a lot of the documentation is published, including inspection reports. Now, I think this is very well, one should note it, whether it's good or bad will really depend on how good Irish sites and Irish, I suppose, sponsors are doing. Because if the HPRA inspection reports are published, then it's going to be obvious which sites are doing really well and which sites maybe are not doing so well as regards quality and the number of findings, so critical findings, major findings, etc. So these inspection reports will be up there for the public and for sponsor companies to view. So it's also, in theory, patients can search for trials in which to participate. I know how to search it. It's really easy, and I'm going to show you a few screenshots, but I doubt if most patients know much about this. So there is a whole part of education there, and I presume that people like iPosy, the patient platform there led by Derek Mitchell, that they will have courses and information and so on. And certainly on our NCTO website, we've put it up. This is the link if you want to search for a clinical trial in Europe. They're all up there. So the challenges, I was thinking about this, and I think, like, if I was working for a big CRO, which I have done in the past, or if I was working for a pharma company and we had lots of resources, this would be a fantastic advance, because like, instead of applying to all the different countries separately, you only apply to one. You'll have the specialist knowledge and skills needed there. There'll be several people in a large company that can use CETUS. It does have very tight timelines. So I think for the smaller sponsors, like small companies, or for academic institutions, which I now work for and have worked for UCC in the past as well, it can be quite difficult, because you need at least two people. So you need a person and a backup person who will have the skills to be able to apply for a clinical trial. I think it would be practically impossible for an investigator to do this themselves, even though in the past I know that they have done so when I was kind of HPRA and ethics committee. So it really means you do need people with the skills. It's like anything else. Once you've done it a few times, it's easy when you know how. But it does mean you have to have a number of people within the sponsor organisation with the specialised skills in CETUS, and keeping an eye on it, because it has very tight tight timelines, and if you miss a deadline for, say, a response to a request for information, the application becomes void and you have to start again. So, and it doesn't apparently it doesn't give you push notifications. You have to go in and check. So really, after you've put in an application, you're going and checking every day, is there anything that they need from you? So really, I suppose the issues I've highlighted are mainly kind of coming from my stance as working as academic sponsor in Trinity, or working as an academic sponsor at the moment, where resources are necessarily limited. You know, it's not a university's primary purpose, you know, carrying out clinical trials, but I think it's a very important part of what institutions, academic institutions do. Also, there are no fee waivers for academic sponsors. Obviously, this system has to have a lot of support, the CETIS, and there's a lot of people in there, I'm sure, working on it. So there are no fee waivers, which in the past, the HPRA and the research ethics were very good to the academic institutions and would often give a fee waiver if you requested it. So just a quick few screenshots here on searching for clinical trials. I've put the link in the previous slide. It's just literally euclinicaltrials.eu, and the searching, look, there's a little box there that says search clinical trials and reports. And just the next screenshot. So you can search, you can do a very simple search like containing any of these terms. For example, I put in the term dementia. There's also advanced criteria. You can search by country, you can search by practically anything. But for example, I just put in looking at how many are in Ireland at the moment, how many clinical trials are in the new CETA system. So there are only 10 at the moment. And I just, out of interest, I looked at Denmark because we have a similar population number, and we're often compared with Denmark in that way, that we, you know, kind of have a similar sort of size country and population. They have 84 clinical trials in there compared to our 10. Okay, so we've done that kind of, I suppose, the regulators bit. So ethics approval also comes in under regulatory affairs. So we'll move on to that now. So do we use the local rec or do we use the NREC? Well, the National Research Ethics Committee, or NREC, was set up specifically to enable this clinical trials regulation, to make sure that we'd be able to actually be able to take part in this huge European initiative. And NREC only cover regulated clinical trials, by which I mean clinical trials of investigational medicinal products, or clinical investigations of medical devices. NREC have two different committees. Well, they have three actually, sorry. They have clinical trial A, clinical trial B, and then they have medical device, just one committee. And basically for any trials that would have come under HPRA before, these are the trials that need to go into NREC. So for anything else, any other types of trials like observational trials, retrospective data analysis, biobanking, exercise, physiotherapy, any of those kind of interventions, basically anything that isn't an investigational medicinal product or medical device, anything else goes to your local rec. Just a word of caution as well, because we need to be careful that, are we sure it wouldn't be treated as something coming under the clinical trial regulation, as a regulated clinical trial. So if you decide, well, I'm going to compare two drugs that are already on the market, and simplistically here, aspirin versus placebo versus paracetamol for headache. So I'm going to say all the people that are coming into my GP practice, patients 1, 3, 5, 7, etc., all the uneven numbers will get aspirin, and all the even numbers, patient 2, 4, 6, 8, etc., will get paracetamol. That is actually seen as a regulated clinical trial. It comes under the clinical trials regulation. So even though the medicines are already on the market, you are mandating you're randomizing, and so you're mandating treatment via the protocol. So the protocol is telling you, yes, this person should go into this stream, so it's not just the clinical judgment. I'm deciding as clinician whether you should be on aspirin or paracetamol. Just be careful of that. So a lot of these trials now of existing medications would come in as what they are now. There's a new kind of a section or definition, I suppose, under the clinical trial regulation, which they call low interventional trials. So it would be where, you know, the drug is already on the market, that you're not doing any major invasive kind of tests, etc. And so they would come under as low interventional clinical trials. I've been trying to find out, well, what exactly does that means in terms of conducting the trial, which I think would be the most important, and I really can't see that they're going to give you much leeway on that. One of the things that you might find is that maybe you'd be able to reuse the medication, put it into kind of pharmacy stock at the end. That is one thing, rather than having to, you know, destroy it, which you normally have to do with clinical trial drugs. So, you know, I think so. So there's maybe a little bit of leeway there for less stringent, say, even monitoring. But generally, you know, it's not a kind of a really easy light touch type of a study, just because it's classed as a low interventional clinical trial. Okay, so we looked at regulatory, we looked at ethics, and now we're going to have a quick look at insurance considerations. So there's a statement in the, I was looking at the guide to clinical trials conducted under the clinical trial regulation, which the HPRA published. I've put in a link there as well. It's really good. Kind of have it handy, have a link to it if you're going to do a clinical trial in Ireland under the clinical trials regulation. It's really good because they've gone through the regulation for you and highlighted all the really important things. Now, it's still quite a big document, but it's certainly easier than reading the actual regulation itself. I've read both. Okay, so it basically says that around damage compensation, a clinical trial must not be conducted in Ireland unless there is in place a policy of insurance or an indemnity scheme to provide compensation for any damage suffered by a subject resulting from participation in the clinical trial, which makes complete sense. And I think we all knew that anyway. You have to have various insurance indemnity in place for your clinical trial. So it also goes on to say that the policy or scheme should be appropriate to the nature and the extent of the risk. So the sponsor should make use of any appropriate arrangements existing in Ireland. For example, an insurance or guarantee or similar arrangement. And it's up to NREC to have a look at this and make sure that they consider the insurance adequate. So in Ireland, you know, the way they say there about using an existing system. So the existing system in Ireland is called the Clinical Indemnity Scheme, the CIS, not CSI as in Miami, but CIS, and it's run by the state's claims agency. I've put a link there underneath again for your convenience. So this covers personal injury risks and subsequent claims or liabilities arising from negligent act or omission associated with the provision of or failure to provide professional medical services on the part of a designated state authority covered by the CIS. Sorry, that's a lot of very legalese, and I'm not a lawyer, but basically if I were to put that in kind of layperson's terms, I would say that the clinical indemnity scheme covers malpractice or negligence that is carried out by somebody who is employed by a designated state authority, would be, say, a HSE hospital. Now, private hospitals wouldn't come under that, or GP practices, so they would need their own medical malpractice negligence insurance. There's a really good document called SIG 1003, which is about clinical trials and insurance arrangements. And it's only a couple of pages. And again, I'd advise you have a look at that and download it. So as well as your clinical indemnity scheme, which is obviously covering the doctors, nurses, etc., the employees of the HSE hospitals, it also covers employees of the clinical research facilities. And again, that SIG 10.3 document tells you that. But so you've covered the, you know, okay, if somebody makes a mistake, if there's negligence, malpractice, etc. But what about the trial protocol, the trial design? So if I wrote a protocol and it says, well, take the take the left hand of the of the patient on the first visit. That's an extreme example, but you know what I mean. If there's something that the trial design, the trial protocol is telling, is mandating, and that turns out to cause an issue, who's covering that? Well, basically, the sponsor has to ensure the protocol and the study design. And then you also have to think about product insurance. So usually the sponsor tends to be the manufacturer of the product, and so then they are covering that as well. Now, again, because I work in a university setting with a lot of investigator-led trials, which I think some of you do as well, often what happens is maybe you're using a marketed product, it's already out there in the market, in which case it has to be insured by the manufacturer anyway. And you also might be using product where they've actually given you the product. So there's a couple of studies I worked on. One was the Emmy study in Cork with Professor Derek Power, and the company BMS had given him a supply of ipilimumab, which is quite expensive. He had sent in a kind of a, I suppose, a protocol and said, look, I'd like to do this study and I think it could be useful for malignant melanoma, etc. So they said, okay, well, we'll support you in that by, we're not going to give you a load of money, but we'll give you the drug, and you'll mention us in the publications, etc. So they would then indemnify the product. So if there's something wrong with the product, or the person is damaged because of the product, the manufacturer was covering that. So like it can be quite complicated in I suppose in academic sponsors. So you're okay. You've got the CIS scheme, which if you're working in a public hospital, if it's not a public hospital, then you have to look at, if you're working at, say, I don't know, Bon Secours or the Mater Private, you know, they have to work out all that, how are the staff covered, and then you also, who designed the trial and the protocol. Often that's the PI who is working for the academic institution, so this institution has to cover that, the sponsor covers that, and then the product. Generally, universities don't make products, though if you're talking medical devices, that might actually be a case that they might come up with some kind of prototype, etc. But generally, the manufacturer of the product covers the product. So they have to talk to the legal people in the university, and there's an agreement saying, yes, we'll indemnify the product. So the amount of insurance required generally for a clinical trial is 6.5 million. That hasn't changed in about 30 years, so I'm kind of surprised that hasn't gone up at this stage. When I look at the claims that, you know, if you see, say, a medical malpractice or negligence, and you see the amount of money that people kind of get in claims in the Irish courts. So 6.5 million for a clinical trial. There's no standard equivalent amount for clinical investigations of medical devices. Generally, that has to be based on the risks. And I've actually asked the HPRA about this in the past, and they say, no, we're not going to give you a standard amount because devices vary so hugely. A device can be a plaster, it can be you know, or it could be a brain implant. So really, depending on the risk, you're going to have to look at your amount of insurance, and then it's really up to the ethics committee to decide if they think that's adequate, and if it isn't, then they will come back to you and ask you to increase the insurance. This again is from that SIG 10.3 document, which is on the clinical indemnity scheme website, and it gives a very nice summary there of the risks and who covers the responsibility. So it talks about the personal injury to patient, personal risks and subsequent claims, and basically, so it's the CIS in a designated state, like a public hospital, etc. So the CIS, the clinical indemnity scheme. So then for the actual product, it has to be 6.5 million, and that has to come from the sponsor. And also the clinical trial cover, which is covering your protocol and study design, has to be 6.5 million in annual aggregate, and that has to come from the sponsor. Then things like employer's liability. So, for example, if I was, I don't know, if I was monitoring a study or auditing a study for Trinity, you know, to cover me for doing that activity in case I make a mistake and I let something go or whatever. So it's a nice little summary there of who needs to cover what. So where are we now? So we've looked at the clinical research legislation in Ireland. We've looked at the regulatory, research ethics and insurance requirements in Ireland. So I'll take a breath now. And then we look at informed consent and consenting. under, I suppose, the clinical trial regulation and also under ICH GCP. Now, I'm not going to repeat a lot of what you've heard in your ICH GCP courses, which I'm sure you're all really familiar with, but basically just a reminder that still stands. That's very important as regards informed consent and consenting. But just to look, let's see what the clinical trial regulation says about it. It basically defines informed consent as subject's free and voluntary expression of his or her willingness to participate in a particular clinical trial, having been informed of all aspects of the clinical trial that are relevant to the subject's decision to participate, or in the case of minors or incapacitated subjects, which I presume will be of interest to this network, an authorization or agreement from their legally designated representative to include them in the clinical trial. And Chapter 4 specifies how informed consent should be obtained and documented. So, that's why it's called informed consent, having been informed of all aspects of the trial that are relevant to the decision to participate. So what is covered here, what in the clinical trials regulation, it gives more clarity on incapacitated adults, minors, emergency trials and cluster trials. So we'll look at each of those now, particularly I think for you guys, the incapacitated adult, and I suppose it says that, because one of the things is, well, what is the legal representative in Ireland? Who can give consent on behalf of someone who may not have the capacity to do that themselves? So it says, in the case of an incapacitated subject, the definition of the legally designated representative has been expanded to include family member or persons with a personal relationship with the subject. Or if either of these is not available or unwilling to provide consent, a medical practitioner who is primarily responsible for the medical treatment of the proposed subject. I guess the problem with that for me is that could be the very person who's wanting to consent someone into a study. So then I guess it would have to be more, someone more independent, but who is responsible for the care of the medical care of the proposed subject. So maybe you could have a sub-I consenting the person. It's an interesting one. I'll be interested to see how that works out. Okay, so in all cases, it says that the legally designated representative should be able to provide the best interpretation of the will and preferences. So if you are going in with your mother, who is perhaps incapacitated, and you are being asked to take part in a clinical trial, and you know that she has always been dead against taking part in any trials and thinks that, I won't be a guinea pig for anyone, then it's up to you to represent that stance and her will and her preference. However, on the opposite side, if somebody hasn't expressed any such kind of vehement opinions, or who is kind of pro-science and pro-research and thinks it's good to increase the sum of knowledge for other people and for other people suffering from this condition, then again it's up to you to represent that person's will and kind of things that they have mentioned in the past. So the legally designated representative, so it's family member or person with a personal relationship. Now, if that person is unable or unwilling to provide consent, so say the person comes in, maybe they've been knocked down and they have a head injury and hence they're incapacitated. In the past, this was really difficult in Ireland in studies, and I was involved in a HPRA inspection of such a study. It was an English sponsor who had assumed that the law in England was the same as the law in Ireland, and it wasn't. So basically, in Ireland, you really couldn't, at that time, you couldn't have a doctor consenting the patient. It had to be a solicitor that was working for the HSE, basically, and that hadn't happened in this particular study. So that was a fairly major finding. But now this is what the clinical trial regulation is saying. SI 99, Part 4, is also kind of in the law, in the Irish law, this kind of what's about this copper fastens this. So and you can see more detail there in the guide to clinical trials conducted under the CTR from the HPRA. So legally designated representative. So I should mention at this stage the HSE published a document on consenting. That's a guideline. So if you're talking about patients in a clinical trial, you actually have to go with the clinical trial regulation, which is the law. and the HSE document is a guideline which they published. So the law always trumps a guideline. The other groups I mentioned there that are kind of, there's more clarity in the clinical trial regulation: minors, so minors, emergency studies, and cluster. So a minor, you have to ask a legally designated representative who is a guardian. They should provide consent, and you should also ask for assent of the minor, where the minor is capable of forming an opinion and assessing the information. So obviously, if if you're talking about a neonate or a toddler, then it's not perhaps as easy to get assent. But say a child of 7 or 8, certainly they can understand what's being asked of them, and maybe with pictures and videos and so on and cartoons, they would be able to form an opinion and assess the information. So for emergency studies, informed consent for a subject to participate may be obtained after the investigator's decision to include the subject, provided that this decision is taken at the time of the first intervention, it's in accordance with the protocol, and if the conditions fulfilled in Article 35 are fulfilled. So we will look at the conditions in Article 35 in a few minutes. It's things like that there's some direct benefit to the patient, that there's no undue kind of financial inducement, that kind of thing, but we will look at that. Then cluster studies, I'm sure some of you are familiar with them, where a cluster, you'd say, well, everyone in, say, the Mercy Hospital in Cork will be given treatment A, and everyone in St. James's Hospital in Dublin will be given treatment B. That would be the kind of the cluster randomization. So there's a simplified means of consent there, so long as certain conditions which are listed here are met. So the IMPs have to be used in accordance with their marketing authorization. So you're using it for the purpose, the indication which it's marketed. The individual receives standard treatment. Even if they don't want to take part in the clinical trial, they'll still receive kind of normal medical care. And the only consequence of non-participation, if they say I don't want to take part, is that, they're still going to get the standard of care treatment. The only thing is their data won't be used. It says if authorised in Ireland, that they're always mononational, so it can only be conducted in Ireland. So you can't get this simplified kind of cluster consenting for a multinational trial. Now, we mentioned there Article 35 of the clinical trial regulation, and Article 31 is coming up here now. So in the clinical trial regulation, it basically says very much the same as we're used to with ICH and so on. The information has to be in writing, available to the subject or their legally designated representative, provided by a member of the investigation team, and the consent should be written, personally dated and signed by the person performing the interview and by the subject or their legal representative. If the subject is unable to read or write, then at least one impartial witness must sign and date the consent to say, basically what they're doing is they're witnessing that they heard the verbal consent. They're not consenting for the patient. They're saying, I heard Ruben saying, yes, she's happy to take part in the study, having heard all the information about it. The subject or legally designated representative must be given a copy of the record. This should interest you guys. Now, for incapacitated subjects who are incapable of giving consent, this must instead be provided via their legally designated representative, and we mentioned who that was. And basically that the following conditions, which are in Article 31, must be fulfilled. So this would apply, I presume, to most studies where you're looking at people with certainly with kind of advanced cognitive issues with dementia. So the trial relates to the medical condition from which they're suffering. You expect some kind of a direct benefit to the participant or to the population represented by that participant, that there's a minimal risk and burden to the participant. Burden would be like, oh, you've got to come in for 15 visits every day for the next 10 months or something. So minimal risk and minimal burden, no financial inducements to participate in the study, and you can't get the data from other people who could give their own consent. So if you can, you're not going to use this population unless it's to study the disease they've got. You can't get the information by looking at you know, a different population of healthy individuals or something who can give their own consent. And the explicit wish of the person should be taken into account. So again, if the person is, you know, they should get information in a form and kind of to the that's appropriate to their understanding. And again, you can use kind of visuals, things like video, all sorts of things are being used now, audio, video recordings, that kind of thing, or kind of, yeah, pictures, infograms, or, you know, maybe repeating it a couple of times, whatever it takes. So they're the kind of conditions of doing a trial, I suppose, in patients who are incapacitated. There's just a very quick there, I'm mentioning ICH GCP because you know, that's something we're all very familiar with, and the things like personally signing and dating, document it in the patient notes and give copies is what we're all used to doing. Now, one thing to be really, really aware of. So the person is giving consent to take part in the study, the person themselves or their legally designated representative, but you also have to get consent to process their data. So in a situation where the person themselves is not giving consent, like I was involved in the Solidarity trial, which was during the COVID pandemic there, and you might have some people who would be intubated or be unconscious. So, and in that case, a relative might give consent for them to take part in the trial, their legally designated representative. However, you can't use that data because the person themselves hasn't given explicit consent for you to process their data. And that came about because of the health research regulations. It's a situation that is unique to Ireland, and the health research regulations came in 2018, and they were amended in 2021. So it's kind of a bit that sits on top of the Irish data protection legislation. So the only way of getting patients who cannot explicitly give consent for the data to be processed is if you get what's called a HRCDC consent declaration. I've put a link in there, but it's the Health Research Consent Declaration Committee. So basically you make an application to the Health Research Consent Declaration Committee stating why you can't get explicit consent from the patient or the person themselves, and what kind of safeguards you're going to put in to make sure that the data is you know, that you need this data. You can get the consent from the legal representative, but they can't give consent to process the data. So it's as I say, it's unique to Ireland, this situation. Now, an interesting one for a lot of you, I think, today will be about the nurses taking consent in a clinical trial. And the CTR, the clinical trial regulation, allows for this. And it puts in, again, a certain kind of number of if conditions, really. So if the PI deems the nurse to be appropriately trained, qualified, and experienced. So again, it's kind of putting the responsibility on the PI to say, yes, if you think that the nurse is appropriately trained, qualified, experienced, yes, they can take the consent. The PI will have to delegate this on the delegation log, and remember that the nurse is still under the supervision of the PI who has delegated the task, similar to any task that's delegated on the delegation log, like to the sub-I, anyone else on that, the research assistants, etc. So I think some nurses are delighted with this. I think it's great. I think it's not before time. Nurses should have been, you know, allowed to take consent. They're the ones who often know the patients really well, and patients might be more inclined to ask questions or to challenge, etc., compared to, you know, if they only meet a consultant once every couple of months, maybe they'll be a bit more wary and, you know, kind of respectful and don't want to ask awkward questions like, why should I take part in this trial? So we asked the HPRA a couple of questions about this. We, being the National Clinical Trials Office, we have a compliance meeting with them every year, usually in the autumn, and we asked them two questions, which we'll have a look here. Sorry, to come back to that other one. Okay, so we asked them, have you any examples of where it mightn't be appropriate for a nurse to take consent? And they're basically, the HPRA came back and said, no, there are no specific types of trials where nurse consenting would be deemed inappropriate. The appropriateness of delegating the conduct of informed consent isn't down to the type of trial, but really to do with the experience and qualifications of the nurse and the complexity and the risk of the trial. and the consent process. And again, it's back to the PI to decide if they're happy with a particular nurse taking consent for this study. So the PI will have to deem that the nurse is suitable. And then we also asked, it was actually Deirdre Highland is big into training. As you know, we lost Deirdre to retirement, unfortunately, lately. We lost her expertise from the Quality Working Group in the NCTO. So she was asking about training. Would any particular type of training be appropriate? And again, they said there's no specific training requirements. In addition to your standard GCP training and your training on the study, it really is to do with the nurse's qualification and experience. And how many clinical trials and so on, and informed consent processing, how complex that is. So they're very keen to say at the end, it remains the investigator's responsibility to check that the subjects are eligible. So that isn't a nurse task. The nurse isn't saying, yes, I've checked the inclusion exclusion criteria and they can go on the trial. That's not the nurse's remit. It's the investigator's remit always to check that and to decide to enroll someone. But then they can say, okay, now I'll hand you over to my colleague who will do the consenting with you. Okay, so, right, I know we're running tight on time now. I always take longer than I think. Okay, so we've covered those topics. We'll do a quick look at quality and risk management. So risk management, again, on the kind of sponsor side, I'm involved in this quite a lot. So every time we're deciding in Trinity, do we sponsor a study or not? Well, first of all, you're going to do a risk assessment. You and the PI, the sponsor and PI, will sit down and do a risk assessment. So first of all, you've got to identify the risks. What are the risks? And assess them, then control them or mitigate them, and then later on review them. So what kind of risks are we talking about? Well, if you're carrying out a clinical trial, the kind of risks that you're looking at are things like the trial design and complexity. The more complex a trial, the higher the risk that somebody will do something wrong, or that somebody will get mixed up. The drug, the IMP there, which is the medicinal product, investigational medicinal product. Again, if it's something that's been around for years, has a big safety record, it's going to be less of a risk than something that's really new and isn't yet on the market. Things like site experience is absolutely critical, and site facilities. So again, if you're dealing with a very new site who've never done studies or trials before, compared to you're dealing with a site that has a lot of experience in this particular types of studies and they have all the right facilities. So, for example, if your study requires a particular type of equipment like a refrigeration centrifuge or a -80 freezer, do they have it? Things like geographical location as well may be a factor, a risk factor. In that, if you're trying to do a study on malaria, it's not much point doing it in Ballydehob in West Cork, hopefully. It's the wrong place. The study population, again, if you're talking about what would be seen as a vulnerable population, that's going to be higher risk. So, children under 5, neonates, pregnant women, or people in position where there might be an imbalance of power, like people living in a care home, people, prisoners that, are, again, people with I suppose with dementia would probably fit in there as a potentially vulnerable population due to their cognitive, I suppose, difficulties. Then things like external vendors as well. Are you using a central lab? Are you using an external X-ray facility? Make sure that you'd have to make sure they know what they're doing as well, because they're obviously bringing risk into the equation as well. So the kind of risk, I suppose, matrix that I'd be used to working at looks a bit like this. So the thing is, you're looking at a couple of different factors. You're looking at the probability and the impact, and then you add that up to a score. This is the one I'm familiar with anyway. So probability of a negative event arising. So you have the high probability, medium or low, 3, 2, 1 there. And then the impact, like if it did occur, would it have a hugely serious impact, which would be 3, or would it have a fairly minimal impact or no significant impact? So for example, something it's very unlikely to occur, which would give it a score of 1. But like if it does happen, it'll be really severe. It'll be significant kind of non-compliance with GCP. So that'll give a score of 3. So if we add the 3 and the 1, we add the probability and impact, and we get a risk score. So in this case, I've added 3 and 1, which is 4, and that comes as unacceptable, medium risk, unacceptable. So you can see there the different categories. You've got high risk, medium risk, low risk. And basically, if anything, when I do my risk assessment, if anything comes up as unacceptable, then I have to do something about mitigating that risk. So for example, we mentioned there all the different types of risk coming from the population, from the geographical location, etc., etc. So say if we look at population, the kind of questions you're asking on your risk assessment are, what's the severity of the condition? Is the population considered to be vulnerable? Are there special considerations? And an example of how you might kind of mitigate some of those risks, for example, like there I've given an example. We don't know if the drug has an effect on the fetus, which is a high risk. So you either eliminate the risk, so you could, for example, exclude women of childbearing potential from the trial, or you could reduce the risk, do a pregnancy test at inclusion and at each study visit. So depending on the level of risk, you're going to want to either totally exclude it, or if not possible, you're going to want to reduce it. So yeah, so you either eliminate it or reduce it. Another few kind of risk mitigation examples there. Say there's a site staff aren't experienced in clinical trials. Well, then obviously providing adequate training for them, or maybe getting someone in from another unit or something that would help them with the setup, or things like that to mentor them. For example, IMP, if that must be kept at a certain temperature, maybe that's a risk, obviously, that goes out of spec. So maybe the sponsor provides a fridge and maybe some kind of monitoring system that will provide an alarm if the fridge goes out of spec, that kind of thing. Final couple of slides there on quality then, because I suppose they're the areas I work in, quality, compliance, etc. So people talk an awful lot about quality by design these days. So quality by design is really kind of, well, how do you make it difficult for people to make mistakes? Somebody gave the example of a door handle. Like if a door handle is well designed, you'll know which way, you'll know whether you should be pulling it or pushing it or twisting it, or, it's going to be really obvious what you do with it. So the same with your protocol, your CRF, your electronic data capture system. Make it difficult to make mistakes is what you want to do. So for example, you've got data checks in your electronic data capture system. So if you're going to put in that someone is 9,300 years old, it's not going to let you if it's well designed. It'll actually say, no, the age must be between 0 and 99, or 0 and whatever, 120 maybe, if you're very lucky and live that old. So that's really what we mean by quality and design, and really it quality by design, and really it's kind of a sponsor oversight, the whole kind of quality issues. So QA and QC, I would very simplistically think that quality assurance is kind of you're setting things up to assure the quality before you start. So things like writing written SOPs, pharmacy manuals, work instructions, providing training. This is so kind of in advance of doing the work, you're setting things up in such a way that you'll assure the quality. A green light process for sponsor, so that you're checking, is everything there before we even start? And then I would say QC would be checking on the quality once you've started. So that'll include things like monitoring, or sponsor audit, looking at, say, if a lab has external accreditation, and things like, I'm sure some of the staff in the CRFs will be doing their internal quality checks on all sorts of processes. Things like if you're looking at the IMP at the pharmacy, maybe get a second person to look at it, that kind of thing. So again, I think it's probably my last slide. You'll be glad to know. So QA, I would say, is process orientated, and you're trying to prevent defects. It's proactive. So you're doing in advance. You're saying it's really a managerial tool and it's everyone's responsibility. QC is product orientated, product or service, I suppose. So you're seeing other defects in the kind of the product at the other end, and it's a reactive and corrective tool. And again, that often tends to be the quality team looking at that by doing monitoring, doing audits, doing quality checks, doing QC and data, that kind of thing. So that's my very simplistic quality kind of summary there. Okay, so that's it. I look forward to meeting you for the questions, and thank you very much.